I want to welcome everybody back to the All About Us podcast, where we deep dive into the stories, struggles, and strategies shaping our communities today. I'm your host, Carl, and in this episode, we are honored to be joined by Jen Soriano, a Filipino-American writer, performer, and scholar whose works live at the powerful crossroads of grassroots activism, narrative strategy, and healing. Jen is the author of Nervous, winner of the 2024 Memoir Prize, and a generational trauma expert whose writing boldly challenges oppressive narratives. Today, we're talking about something deeply important: multi-generational trauma and the pathways to recovery, especially in marginalized communities. How are you doing today, Jen?
Doing pretty good today. Yeah, thankful for another day. How about yourself?
Doing great. So let's start on this. Your personal journey and background. Can you take us back to your early influences? What first brought you into the work of storytelling and social changes?
Great question. I'd have to say books. It sounds really corny, but books really were my best friends when I was growing up. Besides my brothers, we lived in a kind of a isolated area of Chicagoland that was sort of in between farmland and developing suburb. So I actually didn't have a lot of friends around. That's definitely not kids my age. And so
I didn't know I didn't know such a place existed in Chicago.
I don't think it does anymore. I'm old enough that that was back in the ancient days that I was growing up. So, this was the 70s,
Right.
80s.
Right around the time I was blowing up. So yeah.
There you go. Yeah. So, it's probably all strip malls now,
Right.
but back then it felt real, almost semi-rural, even though we are only about 20 minutes outside the south side of Chicago. And I spent a lot of time with books. My parents, I was the only girl, so my parents were really overprotective of me. So I didn't get to go out very much. And so books were my world. And I got to travel through books. I got to have experiences through books. And, that's really what led me to storytelling and wanting to tell some of my own story to share with others who might feel like they don't get exposed to stories like mine, or they don't get to see themselves reflected, except for stories like mine.
Okay, you didn't have a lot of interaction with other children or families because you were in a rural area. But that also had to be a little different for you, because I'm just reflecting back on my childhood. And I grew up in Reading, Pennsylvania. And at that time, we had very few Asians. I mean, we may have had like maybe one or two students, throughout my whole entire journey through high school. So you were probably an anomaly then, weren't you?
Oh, yeah, we definitely were. You got it right. Yeah, we were definitely surrounded by mostly white families who, also had immigrant histories, but that's not
Right,
something that really came out, right? At
right,
the time.
exactly.
It's the only thing that came out is like, well, you look different and wow, amazing that you speak English.
Okay,
We
right.
got to those types of interactions.
Okay. So at an early age, because of your semi-isolation, you really found books as your best friend and your escape. What type of books were you particularly interested in?
Well, I was always most interested in the books that my mom kept high up on her shelves that I was supposed to read. Those were the ones that I was like, those are the ones I most want to read. There must be something good in those books, and she kind of keep them away from me. And actually, that is how I got exposed really early on, probably before I could really fully understand it, to Toni Morrison, because my mom had Toni Morrison up on her shelf. She had Beloved up high on her shelf. And, for understandable reasons, that's very heavy in material. But I did get into that pretty young, and Toni Morrison has always been one of my greatest influences. But I also read, the stuff that a Midwestern girl would have been exposed to, right? Babysitter's Club and Anna Green Gables type of stories. And I can't say that Babysitter's Club was a big influence on me, but the books that were like, for better or for worse, Little House on the Prairie, Anna Green Gables, those did expose me to a kind of sweep of storytelling and, kind of intimacy of people's personal stories made up as they were that was really appealing to me. And there was something, really powerful also about being able to focus in on girls
Mhm.
as protagonists
Mhm,
and
mhm.
characters.
Okay. How did your upbringing as a Filipino American growing in a landlocked part of Chicago shape your understanding of generational trauma?
Well,
Or maybe it didn't.
it did, but a lot of it was in retrospect,
Okay.
after I left the middle part of the country and had the privilege to come out to, what I thought of when I first came out as sort of these Filipino power centers on the
Correct.
coast.
Correct.
Right. So when I was in my early 20s, I moved out to San Francisco. And from there, I got exposed to a community that helped me learn about Philippine history, about Filipino-American history in a way that I never learned in school, because one of the products of colonial erasure on the part of the Americans being in the Philippines was also sort of cultural and historical erasure. Right? We don't learn anything about American imperialism in the Philippines in our school curriculum. So I had to learn it from community, and I started to learn it from community in San Francisco, which then gave me the perspective on my childhood, and it made me realize that not everybody grows up so isolated in a predominantly white area in the middle of the country without access to resources about your own history. But a lot of people do. And I think that my experience with sort of isolation from my culture and ethnic community was another layer of difficulty, I would say. I'm not sure that it was actually traumatic, but it was definitely a challenge that layered on top of the generational trauma that I inherited from my ancestors' direct experiences with displacement, war, forced migration, coerced migration. And so I think that if I have a theory, right? Don't know because I can't live my life over and change things, but I have a theory that if I had grown up in a place like San Francisco, I think I would have been able to process and understand generational trauma at an earlier age, but maybe not, because maybe then I would have just taken it for granted. I think growing up in a place that was especially isolating maybe forced me to search more for answers.
Yeah, that's in, just that whole Asian Pacific area there. Traditionally, through history, they've been through a lot. I mean, you had the British imperialism, then you had China, and then at some point it was like a kind of combination of Chinese and English, England taking over particular areas of those islands all through the strip, then Japan.
That's right.
I mean, it's been, a constant turmoil and turnover culturally there that a lot of people aren't familiar with. So, yeah,
Hold on. You're absolutely right.
unpacking all of that that's, traveling down through the generations of being occupied by so many different people, I can't even imagine really the type of impact that can have on you without you really realizing it.
You are exactly right. You are so spot on about it. And not only do a lot of people in general not know about that history, but a lot of Filipinos ourselves don't even know about that history. And so we're walking around carrying this legacy of struggle and violence and takeover without even knowing it. And actually, I did not even know until I wrote this book. So really didn't know until the past couple years the degree to which during Spanish colonization, which lasted more than 300 years, Spaniards treated the Filipinos generally very differently from how they treated the majority of what's now considered Latin America. I think because of the geopolitical location of the Philippines as sort of a gateway into Asia, they treated Filipinos much less as potential Spanish citizens under the US crown, which is why they didn't really teach Spanish to the Filipinos as opposed to other people in Latin America, but more as human bodies to be able to retain control of the ports in the Philippines. And so the Spaniards really used the Filipinos as soldiers in their empire to fight off every single invading force that wanted to take over the ports. And that includes, like you had said, the British, but it's also the Dutch, the Portuguese, and then eventually also the Chinese and the Japanese came later under the Americans. But yeah, it is very much like you said. It's just been a
Now you opened my eyes because I didn't even know anything that the start of all of this came from Spaniard in Spain. So I knew about what occurred after that time, but I didn't know the root of all this. This is very interesting. For our listeners new to this concept, how do you find multi-generational or intergenerational trauma? Excuse me.
well, I think I would start by saying that trauma is just one of the many things that we inherit. The concept of inheritance is pretty familiar to all of us, right? We think about, I inherited my father's eyes, or, I inherited my mother's skill in math or dancing or whatever. So we think about inherited traits like that a lot. But trauma is also something that we inherit, and it is not just one thing. It can be many things. And actually, there are positives that we can inherit from traumatic pasts. And so I'm going to start there actually, because people don't usually think about inherited trauma being a positive thing. But the truth is that the process of trauma in our bodies is something that begins with a positive, which is we experience trauma and traumatic response in our bodies because we're trying to survive, right? Right. That's pretty positive. Survival is positive. And those survival responses can get lodged in our bodies to the point that we actually pass on markers of the survival response to our children. And then they pass it off to their children. And so, what are some of the positive aspects of this? Well, for me personally, having come from a lineage that we just talked about of constant vigilance, turmoil, and violence, honestly, I think a positive that's come out of that for me is that I have almost like the spidey sense. It's like inherited street sense. You know what I mean? It's inherited street smarts where I just feel like I understand danger
Okay.
in a way that helps me navigate pretty much anywhere that I go. My father is from the hood. I am not from the hood. Okay. I'm from this like suburb rural farmy area, right? But somehow I still feel like I know how to navigate. I know how to navigate in some of the toughest
It's
situations.
generational.
It's generational. It's generational smarts about how to survive. So that's very positive, right? And then there's another sort of more meta positive thing around it that I think I see a lot among people that I work with, who many people do come from histories of colonization, war, enslavement. And there's a commitment, very deep commitment to saying, I've seen this before and I want it to end.
Right.
Right. So there's this very deep commitment to justice, a fighting spirit that we can inherit as a consequence of inherited trauma. So I wanted to start there. And there are also a lot of difficult impacts as well. And one of the reasons that I felt compelled to write about this is because I could see how unresolved trauma was causing so much conflict that didn't really need to be there in my workspaces, for example, and community. and also in family. And so one of the impacts can be that we have this disrupted stress response. That's one of the ways that our nervous systems can be most directly affected by inherited trauma and lived trauma as well, where our normal stress response kicks in response to immediate threat. Somebody's pounding on your door and it's 3 a.m. That's going to cause a stress response that's going to mobilize you to be very alert, to be very careful, and to be ready to defend yourself. You need to have that kind of stress response. But what happens with trauma is that if the threat is overwhelming enough, then that can throw your stress response all out of whack to the point that you have that same kind of stress response, even with slight disturbances, like maybe my husband, criticizing the dinner I made, and then I might be like, that is a threat. That's a threat to my survival because my stress response has been disrupted by trauma. And so it's hard to distinguish between what is truly a possible threat to your life and what actually might just be something that annoys you. And so this disrupted stress response, nervous system dysregulation, and an ability to right size threats and distinguish the past from the present can also be very difficult ongoing impacts of intergenerational trauma.
I think you're probably like my second or third guest to talk about this type of trauma. And for me, initially, when I first heard about it, it kind of like, I was like, wait a minute. And I said, I thought about it, is this really possible? But then, I had to reflect back on one thing. Being in medicine and when I was going through medical school, I did a rotation with child delivery. And the whole thing was even at a couple days old, you could see that these children were almost already complete. It's like I was looking at all these different babies, and I started realizing these kids are like almost 90% of who they are. Like their upbringing and an environment and things like that. Of course, that's going to have some type of, how can I say it, impact on who they become as adults. But it was like you're almost like a complete, you almost have your complete personality at birth. And so I had to sit back and think about it. And I said, maybe this is where a lot of this multi generational thing is passed down into the DNA, through the DNA. So a lot of people really don't realize, hey, you know what? You're pretty much born who you're going to be. Now, your environment, your parents, and social situations may have some impact, but that led me to believe, you know what? There's a lot going on with this multi-generational thing that I never thought about.
Yeah, wow, that is extremely insightful what you just said. And from the perspective of somebody who actually was helping deliver these babies, I've never really thought about it in that way. But something I do write about in the book is how, those babies that do come out by day two, they have been an egg inside their birth parents' body, their mother's body, which was also inside the grandmother's body, right?
Exactly.
And so when you think about that really direct connection, just biologically,
Sure.
right, there is actually more and more evidence of potential mechanisms
Right.
there's more studied actually through the sperm. But I
Right.
mean, you actually realize, right, like, right, we were actually very physically connected
Exactly. Very much so.
to at least two generations back.
Correct. What are some examples of how this kind of trauma manifests, particularly in communications of communities, excuse me, of color and diasporic communities like the Filipino diaspora?
Okay, so now this time I'll start with some of the negatives, right? Because I truly do believe that unresolved trauma is causing more strife in our communities than is necessary, and it's in some ways, doing the work of continued and ongoing work of oppression. So here's some examples. Crab mentality,
You have that
And
too?
oh yeah, yeah. Like, no, you think you're gonna move up in the world? No, no. Like, not you. You're gonna stay down where we are. Don't think that you're too good for the rest of us. Like
Right.
that comes from colonial mentality.
Mhm.
And it is I believe it's a form of unresolved trauma response, and it's a learned unresolved trauma response. There's not enough for everybody because there wasn't deliberately under colonialism. Another thing is in the Filipino community, I think this is a big one. Secrecy and silence is has been a coping mechanism. And I write about how for my family, it wasn't just a coping mechanism. It was actually a survival mechanism that came with a lot of honor. My grandfather was a guerrilla fighter. He became a prisoner of war. He was tortured for information and he stayed silent. And that's something that I'm very proud of in my lineage and that, and that I carry on in my spirit of fighting for justice. But
What war was that?
that was World War II.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So, that kind of forced silence, learned silence and forced silence is another impact of generational trauma. Now, so those are some of the behavioral things, but then there's also, unfortunately, a lot of biological and health consequences as well. So, a lot of the health disparities that BIPOC communities face are influenced by generational trauma. Of course, they're also shaped by ongoing disparities today, socioeconomic disparities, like do you even have access to healthy food through grocery stores? But there's also a dimension of inherited trauma from extreme stress and oppression that contributes to higher rates of everything from diabetes to heart disease to mental illness and even to cancer. So, this is why I say that, and it's not just me, many people who are public health experts say that unresolved trauma is a public health crisis, and it disproportionately impacts descendants of war, colonialism, and enslavement.
Okay. What would you say are some other ways that colonialism, migration, systemic oppression intersect with the transmission of trauma across your generations?
Let's see, other ways. You want to hear some positive ways, or you to hear more about?
Positive and then negative. I mean, you already talked about the health. Health is a portion, but what are some other ways?
I'm going to talk about a positive way. So,
Oh,
one of the most powerful phrases I think that comes from American Indian movements is, we're still here, right? After all these years of genocide and continued disenfranchisement, we're still here. And there's a reason that different kind of communities of struggle are still here. And many of those reasons have to do with cultural resilience strategies. And so I think another, I would say, positive way that all of those things interact is that it really does, in some ways, force a people that level of generational oppression forces a people to develop generational strategies of survival. And for Filipino folks, at least from my particular lineage of Filipinos, but I would say it seems to be pretty universal up and down the archipelago. Music is one of the most powerful generational strategies of cultural resistance that Filipinos have developed. And of course, this is not unique to Filipinos. Of course, we also see the power of that throughout the African diaspora and how much African music influences the rest of the music worldwide. And in my particular lineage, I come from actually a lineage of musicians, and I've just seen how music has been a coping mechanism, but it's also been more than that. It's been also a mechanism for transmitting coded messages in resistance to colonization. And it's also been a mechanism for gathering and organizing people as well. So I think personally, and also if I dare try to speak for, a collective of Filipinos, I would say music is another intersection of inheritance from generations of oppression, resistance, and inherited. And
now that's quite interesting to me. And the reason I find that is quite interesting, I'm a musician also, but I really can't recall hearing any traditional Filipino music. So can you describe what traditional Filipino music sounds like and what instruments they use? Because this is totally new and interesting to me.
yes, that's such a great question. I can tell you're a musician because because it actually is a really deep issue. It's a really deep issue and it's a deep question because the Filipinos have been colonized for so long that we are more known for mimicking Western music than for having our own traditional music. And it's something I try to wrap my head around all the time because I'm married to a Puerto Rican, and Puerto Ricans have colonized as long as we have or longer because they're still a colony, but they have their own right? Syncretic music that they have developed. So I've been like, what's going on here? But let me just start by saying that there is Filipino indigenous music. It just doesn't get shared. It doesn't have, record label distribution. In southern Philippines, there's Muslim traditional music that is very similar to Indonesian music that uses melodic gongs called kulintangs and agongs, and so it's very sort of melodic brass driven. In the northern Philippines, there's indigenous music that also uses a type of gong, but they look like frying pans actually. But it's also melodic as a set of gongs. And they also use mouth harps a lot, which I know is common to many cultures. And bamboo tongatongs is what they're called. So there's a real rich history of pretty amazing indigenous music. But of course, it's still very pigeonholed as like a tribal music that only the Smithsonian would distribute. But there's a lot of artists these days who blend that type of indigenous music with contemporary rock and pop. And so, yeah, so there is that, but it is true that what dominates is Western pop music.
Right. And yeah.
Yeah, and versions of that.
Now you have this new book. Are you a full-time writer? What is your day job?
I wish. I am not a full-time writer. Even with a publishing deal with a big publishing house, and a very generous advance, I was not able to be a full-time writer. I think it's a good reality check for people who want to be writers. Yeah, it's good to be
Also,
it's yeah, it really is a labor of love. And so, but also my day job is a labor of love. So I feel really blessed to be able to work in social justice, racial justice communications and be paid for it. So I'm not a full-time writer, but I full-time think about writing. I'm always conspiring about something I'm going to write. I've got 3 more book projects on the table in my head.
okay. So you work for a nonprofit then, I'm assuming.
I would myself. I have my own business, and I support many nonprofits. In my business.
Okay, I may have to see you. I have a nonprofit called Stand Up and Do Something, and this is an extension of my nonprofit. Actually, this podcast show.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, in your award-winning collection, Nervous, you weave memoir with cultural analysis. How did writing that book contribute to your healing?
It contributed to my healing in some obvious ways, in ways that I think people assume that writing about hard things is a form of catharsis and therapy. And that was true to some degree. There is specifically a great amount of healing that comes from being able to have control over piecing together a bunch of fragments of my life that, really took a lot of work to piece together, including my own medical diagnoses, how that relates to my family history, how that relates to Philippine history. Being able to piece that all together into something that felt like a whole did make me feel more whole. The part that's not as obvious is how ridiculously hard it is to write something so personal. So there are times where it felt the opposite of healing. There are times where it felt like I was tearing off Band-Aids all day and then pouring salt in all the wounds under the Band-Aids and asking myself, why am I doing this? And I always tell people that if they're going to write whatever kind of art form it is, perform, create visual art around something that's very, very personal and potentially re-traumatizing, that it's really important to have support while you do it and to not take it lightly and assume that it's just going to be all rainbows and unicorns while you produce the expression of your experience. So I think, though, that what I just described is really a description of healing in general. So, right. Like it's never, if it's true healing, it is never like a day at the spa. Actually, should be quite painful. Yeah.
It's a process.
Painful
It's a
process.
process. Yeah. What role does creative expression, especially lyric essays and hybrid forms, play in working through trauma?
So this might get a bit more in the weeds of writing craft as a specific art form, but for me, the lyric type of writing and hybrid type of writing, which for folks who may not be familiar with those terms.
What are those terms for my listeners?
Yeah, it means to me a combination of poetry and prose, right? So not just straight up instructional or how to or self-help type prose or journalistic type prose even, but a blend of more poetic or, even song lyric type writing. And for me, bringing in that element of poetry and kind of song type lyricism is extra healing because it actually does activate a different part of your brain that is more associative and less logical. And there is healing in activating and integrating more parts of your brain. And so for me, when I write and I get to really release into something that might not make sense at first, I'm like, oh, this is really where I need to be because it actually is like the somatic process of my body, just kind of intoning as opposed to my brain just saying, this is how it is. So bringing those things together can be very healing.
Okay. Music through words.
Yeah.
Innocent.
Well said.
Innocent.
Very well.
How important is cultural memory in the healing process? And how can we preserve stories that were never written down or passed on?
Oh, I just got the chills from that question. That is a very important question. And the first thing that came to mind when you said cultural memory is my friend who is my friend Kara Page, who does a lot of work around cultural memory and healing justice in the South. And she specifically does work around cultural memory of people and communities who have been disappeared by the medical industrial complex. Yeah. So she's done activations, performances at mental institutions where particularly Black communities have been disappeared in the South. And we have lots of conversations about the importance of this. And cultural memory, the importance of cultural memory is no less than the importance of being able to define the past, present, and future of an entire people. And so that's why under, oppressive regimes and authoritarian regimes, one of the first things that gets attacked is cultural production. And
They erase your cultural history.
exactly.
They attempt to.
They try to ban books. They do ban books. They try to erase certain words from words which are connected with entire identities from public record. And that's because they understand the importance of cultural memory. And so it is absolutely the task of culture bearers and storytellers to not just entertain, but to retain and in some cases reconstruct cultural memory when it is on the brink of or already has been lost. And so for me, there are a lot of gaps in my own ancestral lineage because the records just were never taken or they don't exist. And so I think that there is a role in a lot of our communities in sort of creative historical imagination and almost just trying to imagine, hey, maybe this is what my grandmother was doing during World War I, even though I don't have the record of that. I think there was a second part to your question. What was it again?
Okay, how can we preserve stories that were never written down or passed on?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So this is where my deep belief in cultural practices and social rituals for healing comes in because I think that even if we don't know the stories writ large, like from beginning to end, because they've never been told to us or they're never written down, we know something in our bodies. We carry, right, like what we were talking about before in terms of the transmission of trauma, also carry memories. We do carry ancestral memory in our bodies. Uh, and social rituals and cultural rituals can play a role in being able to bring out some of those memories and be able to shape new stories, which are just as important as the old stories that we may have forgotten. So I think that that's one of the ways is that, and I'll give you an example. There's a dancer named Pearl Abungan who did Filipina, who did a whole dance performance in the Presidio. You might be familiar with the Presidio in San Francisco, the former base. It's actually one of the places from which many naval ships, I believe, were deployed, or anyway, U.S. military were deployed to the Philippines from the Presidio. So today it's a park, and Pearl Abungan did a whole dance activation there, dance performance that brought up some of that cultural memory of being in the belly of the beast as a descendant of people who were sort of caught in the crossfire of the time of World War II. And I remember going to that performance and I didn't know that history at that time. But what it did was it laid a foundation of cultural memory that then was one of the sparks for me to then dig deeper into my own story. So that act of cultural memory then helped me on my journey of creating a new story, which I hope will then contribute to larger cultural memory in the future.
I'm going to depart from my script right now because we're deep into culture right now. And I want to ask you if you're familiar with a term, temporal time perception.
I don't think I've ever heard it like that. No, what does that mean?
Temporal time perception is something that a lot of indigenous cultures have. And because of it, the imperial powers were able to take advantage of us. So, what is temporal time perception? Excuse me. It's something that indigenous cultures, because by the way they survive, they only look at the future in a very short perspective, as far as days, months, maybe even a season. But that's about as far as a lot of indigenous cultures can plan. And so when you're dealing with an imperial power who sits down and they're projecting things out maybe 2, 3 years versus our ability to really only plan out maybe 3 to 6 months. That puts us at a serious disadvantage because of the way we use and we process time. Also, it's very hard for us to even at times project what am I going to be doing 4 years from now on a personal level and write out a personal plan that actually that we would follow to get from point A to point B that may take us 2 to 4 years. It's something which a lot of indigenous cultures struggle with, and it's something that a lot of people don't talk about. And I don't know if they're just not aware of it. But this is something which is part of multi-generational trauma, I would believe. I believe this is something that's passed down genetically, something that, our perception of time and how we view the future and how we approach our future.
That's interesting. I think that there is a lot to be said about colonial time structures. I feel like there is also a lot of positive sort of indigenous traits that we're taking advantage of. And one of those might be some indigenous cultures, perception of temporal time. Although I will say, though, I don't think that's universally true, right? Because if you think about, say, the Aztec and Mayan calendars, right, those projected out circle seasons, right? But then also, if you look at a lot of North American indigenous traditions, right, they're thinking 7 generations worth of time.
Right.
So there's some variation there, but I do think, there's things like different conceptions of time that we're definitely taking advantage of. And the whole idea of Jenny Odell writes about, sort of industrial, westernized, white supremacist time and how that gets imposed. But then also, just indigenous traditions say of like welcoming and giving, right? Those were absolutely exploited. But I think that it can also be a question, I think, just around time, of how much was sort of a conflict between what was already kind of embedded in pre-colonial cultures versus how much actually got imposed and truncated by colonization. You know what I mean? Because I think about how in the Philippines, there's a lot of people who get real down on, Filipino culture and say like, yeah, well, we're just like not very good at planning ahead, or we're not very good at being on time, or, things like that. And I just wonder how much of that was actually learned by colonization, because, it's not like we had a lot of agency to plan for the future
We
under
weren't in
colonization.
control. You had no
Right.
control.
Didn't have much control past, say, 6 months to a year. So I wonder about that.
Yeah, yeah. And also because this is bringing up some other things, I'm still deviating here, is religion. So to talk a little bit about the impact of all of this and how it affects religion. Are there? I'm quite sure. What are traditional religious beliefs in what were they in the Philippines before they were introduced to Christianity?
Great question. Well, there was quite a variety because, before the Spaniards kind of forced the archipelago to become a nation, there was a lot of different types of people on those islands. And many of them actually were of Muslim descendancy from, kind of migrations up from Indonesia. So there were sultanates. There were sultanates all across the archipelago, not just in the south, as where Muslim populations have been kind of forced to concentrate today. So there were a lot of Islamic kind of sultanates. And then there were many what would be called by the Western world like pagan, sort of animistic type tribes that just believed in gods that were part and parcel of every part of nature. So ocean gods, mountain gods, forest gods, uh, eh, harvest gods. So the pre-colonial culture, yes, was a combination of, and then this very different kind of pantheistic, animistic belief systems.
Okay. Getting back on track here now. What what
Loves a conversation.
Yeah, I do too. What does narrative justice mean to you? And how can it serve as a tool for both healing and transformation?
Narrative justice means to me something very similar to what racial justice, economic justice, and gender justice means, which is a widespread equality of multiple stories and a diversity of stories, as opposed to the dominance of just one single story or a few stories that serve to give advantages to a few people while oppressing the majority. So narrative justice looks like all of our stories having the right to be on bookshelves, being taught in schools, and being part of public discussion, the historical record, and cultural memory, and really celebrating a diversity of stories, and also celebrating, as opposed to censoring, stories that may be uncomfortable and painful to some people, including stories where certain people's ancestry talks about, some people have been oppressors. We need to know those stories, and we shouldn't be sanitizing and cleansing history. That's the opposite of narrative justice.
Okay. Do you believe that we will see a day where history will no longer be white man's history?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm just going to say straight up yes.
Will it be in our lifetime?
Well, I was like, we might have to hang on for a while.
All right.
Let's hang on for a while. And I'm going to say hopefully yes.
Okay. Okay. Disrupting narrow worldviews. What does that mean?
It means what I just talked about in terms of narrative justice. So intersectional form is just basically a way of writing that resists being put in a box. So, for me, I got a lot of people in the publishing and writing industry saying, you write about too many different things. You need to just be writing about Asian American history, or just choose one thing. Write about being a woman who's also Asian. And then they're like all generous, and you can write about two things. Meanwhile, what I'm trying to write about, right, is being a second generation immigrant, being a non-binary Filipina-American, being a biologist, being a trauma survivor, being, a daughter, right? So there's the intersectional form is just a fancy way of saying permission to be all of yourselves in your writing. And what does that do on a larger scale? It opens the doors to narrative justice because then in the story unit, you already have a diversity of stories and perspectives. And then if you have more and more of those types of stories, then you have more and more perspectives, like exponentially more out in the world. And that it goes in direct opposition to just having one white man tell you this is how it happens and everything else is revisionist history. It is a populist and democratic way of being able to populate the historical record.
Yeah, it's kind of like when I first started this podcast show, and based upon the name, a lot of people were surprised because I have a lot of different people coming from outside the African culture. But I said, everybody, most people are connected to a diaspora of some type, diaspora of some type, excuse me. And so, I see us as all culturally linked in that way and manner. I said, I think it's important for all of us to learn each other's story. I mean, so we find a collective unity between our experiences, and I think that's I think that's very important. For us to be able to share that and share that to the world. A lot of people are confused with my show. And I said, no, this is what this show's about. This is what this show's about. People from various different cultures coming here and sharing their cultural experiences. And for us to be able to taste and embrace that and have a better understanding of how we all fit in this world and how we can get along together.
Well, see, then your podcast is an example of intersectional form.
Right, exactly. Exactly. Okay. What does it mean to write from the margins?
So for me, it means a couple things. It means acknowledging um, a type of experience that, whether that's because of race, gender, class, nationality, religion, um, that your experiences exist outside of what is normally centered in the society that you live in. Right. So that's number one. Number two, it also means to me what W.B. Du Bois wrote about in terms of double consciousness, right? Is that often people who have the experience of being marginalized and having to observe the center of life and society that does not always represent or include them, that we often develop by necessity of survival and by way of navigating that center in which we're not necessarily included, this way of being able to see the world that is both from the outside and also looking in at the center and understanding the center in a way that folks who have an experience of always living at the center and being catered to at the center don't need to develop about people in the margins. And so there is a sort of gift, and Du Bois wrote about this, a gift that comes from coming from the margins that allows you to have multiple perspectives that people who have sort of the privilege of always being centered don't necessarily develop.
And I'm making an assumption when you talk about center, you're talking about the dominant culture. Okay. And so can you explain to my listeners what the dominant culture is? Because see, to me, I think a lot of us from minority communities or indigenous populations, we are just living without understanding our position in society and how it impacts everything in our life. So explain dominant culture to my listeners.
Here's the most simple way that I can explain it. I mean, I look at this every day and I think, why is this still okay to everybody?
Right.
Is just any TV show that you watch, any given Netflix show that you might stream, any given whatever Apple TV show. Even though and you can think about the thumbnails that they use, to advertise the shows too. And, there's like a bunch of people's faces, right? They're like standing with different poses. So there's always going to be a brown person or a Black person or an Asian person or a Latino person somewhere in that mix. But how often are they really the protagonists? How often are they the center of the show? And even in this day and age where there's a lot of consciousness about that, even still, the majority of center white protagonism in a way, or light-skinned protagonism right? Kind of ethnically ambiguous light-skinned people in a way that is unquestioned. And the fact that I would even say this, some people would be like, "Oh, you're just like nitpicking." And that still is part of that reaction is part of a reflection of the dominant culture, right? Because we just assume, like, why should that be a problem? Why are you even lifting that up as a problem, right? When we live in a majority people of color world, we still accept this as normal. So dominant culture still is largely centered around white life, white norms, and a certain middle class to middle upper class to striver class to striving to be billionaire class type class aesthetic, as well as heteronormativity, right? And straightness. Yeah.
Funny because, as you state, that is the norm. The only company I really see dedicated to really breaking that norm right now is Marvel. And I don't know if you know, are
Yes.
aware of the big struggle right now. They killed off Iron Man, excuse me, and they're bringing back I think it's a Disney television series, a Marvel television series of Ironheart, a young black woman who's taking on the persona of Iron Man. And there is a big, giant uproar about this.
Yeah, because of the gender part specifically?
It's gender and she's African American.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it's kind of a double cross. Okay, Iron Man is the center of the Marvel universe. That was the first, I mean, that was really the first big tent blockbuster for them. And so now they kill off the male white Iron Man, and now they're changing the name and bringing him back as an African American woman. There's a lot of pushback in the community around that.
Yeah, I mean, and that in itself, like the fact that that gets to define the debate about what, I think some communities, like off in our corners, would be like, the debate would just be, there's no debate. This is amazing. This is fantastic. Like, let's get into all the nitty-gritty about the actual universe. But the fact that like that backlash gets to be centered and define so much of the conversation around it is an example of how the dominant culture gets to continue to center itself.
Okay, how has embracing your Filipino roots and your queer non-binary identity impacted the way you move through the world and your work?
I love the way that question is phrased because it has really significantly impacted the way that I move through the world. I think that I actually move through the world more before I had a grounding in collective identity. I just didn't really wanna move through the world that much. I wanted to hide. I wanted to hide and be silent, and I didn't have much confidence in what I had to say, and being able to ground my own identity within a larger Filipino-American, a Filipino migrant, immigrant identity just really connected me to my own ancestral lineage, but also this collective lineage of resistance and struggle that just gives me fuel for moving through the world every day, every single day. And it also gives me a moral compass, honestly, that I think is one of the things that drives me the most. And then in terms of my queer non-binary identity, that's something I came to later in life. And it was really through, I think, a couple of things. Well, I write about it in the book a bit through is actually the experience of being pregnant and birthing that helped me to realize that I don't actually fully identify as a woman. It just isn't it doesn't really sit that way, or at least in the birthing context. And then also, ancestral connection. I've been so deeply walking through the world with the spirits of both my grandfather, the one I mentioned who was a guerrilla fighter, and my grandmother, who was his wife and who was a really just incredible fighter in her own way. She was a single mom, raised four kids for a long time, and just created a successful business out of nothing. And so I carry both of their spirits in my body. And so that non-binary identity really comes from ancestral identification as well. And so that together with the fact that my exposure to queer communities in San Francisco and the Bay Area and also here in Seattle has just really shown me that like I feel so comfortable in queer community because queer communities have a very evolved style of communication, which is really important to me, and also an expansive view of the world. And so, being grounded ethnic community and also queer community has just really given me a sort of sense of home and belonging that isn't necessarily tied to one geographic place, like, or to country or to nationalism.
Great. Now we're going into the part of the show we call flip mode. This is where my guest gets to ask me 3 questions.
Ooh, flip mode. Yeah, Filipinos call ourselves flips, so I know about flip mode. All right. Okay. So why did you start this podcast?
I started this podcast because it was like an outreach of my nonprofit. And I started my nonprofit during the beginning of COVID. And my nonprofit really came out of the George Floyd killing. But it didn't, but it was kind of like, the George Floyd killing put the world at odds with each other. And then out of that came Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter had like this backlash connotation to it. And so what I thought about, I said, well, wouldn't it be nice to have something like Black Lives Matter that included everybody? So I wanted a social justice nonprofit that was for people of all races, all cultural backgrounds, all religions, whatever, your sexual everybody just come up under the tent and fight for what's right for all of us. And so out of that, forming that nonprofit, I decided, well, you know what?
Thanks for sharing that. All right. How about something about your life outside of the podcast and your nonprofit? So what do you end up doing on an average Saturday afternoon?
Sleeping.
Yes, one of my favorite activities.
I'm an Aquarius. And anybody who doesn't understand Aquarius, you do not interfere with our bed and our sleeping. That is like a very, very important part of our existence. And a lot of people don't realize if I'm hungry and sleepy, I'm going to sleep first.
Wow. Oh, that would be a hard choice for me.
See, for me, I can't always get sleep. I can always eat. So, so it's like, okay, I'm sleepy. I'm going to sleep right now. And even if
I did not know that was an Aquarius thing.
yeah, yeah. So we're very, very sleep devoted people. So yeah.
I must have some Aquarius in me. Go back to this. Okay, last question is, if you had to listen to one musical act, one band, one musician for the rest of your life, who would it be?
Christ.
Oh, another thing we have in common. Yes.
So yeah.
Okay, well, can I ask a follow-up? Top Prince song.
My goodness.
I know, so hard. Just first one that comes to mind.
That's hard.
I know. Just for your mood right now. How about that? Mood right now.
Oh, let me Lady Cab Driver.
Okay. Yeah.
And the reason why I say Lady Cab Driver is because it's about, him or any one of us as individuals being so stressed out and up underneath so much pressure that we need to find way to escape. And a lot of people are asking me, because you may not know this, I'm in the process of relocating to Puerto Rico.
Wow. I was there for 4 years.
And that's what it feels like when I'm in Puerto Rico, like I just escaped all of the pressures of the outside world. And so Lady Cab Driver would have to be it. And I know a lot of people haven't heard that song because it's not one of his most radio popular songs.
Right.
But in that, I'm a true Prince fan.
Absolutely. Yes. And now, of course, all your listeners who don't know it are going to go and listen to it with the ear. Yeah.
And they should. And they should. Okay. So reflection and looking forward. What gives you hope in this work, especially when the pain and weight of trauma is feeling very heavy? I mean, we got a lot of things going on in the world right now. Nationally, internationally, I mean, political wise, it seems like everything in the world right now is kind of off kilter.
That's right.
What gives you hope in what you're doing in our future?
Mhm. So I write about this a lot in the book. One of the things that gives me hope is all the ways that organized collective human action can undo all the bad things that organized collective human action puts out in the world, right? I think that, there really is something to the reason, to the way that, say, like the Marvel universe and say Star Wars and Star Trek just continue to be so popular is because there's just something just very elemental about like battles between, sort of the good side of humanity and the bad side of humanity. And there's a lot of the bad that is coming out right now, and a lot of the bad that is coming home to roost around our climate. And so it can be hard. Let me just acknowledge that. It can be hard to have hope. But as Mariam Kaba says, hope is a discipline. And it's a discipline that I try to practice every day by drawing on the little things of, small victories through organizing and activism, but also the little things around the ways that we can show up for each other just in our own personal lives. So, the ways that I don't know, my son is just growing up to be a really thoughtful person. And
How old is your son?
he's 11 now.
Okay.
He's 11 now. And, the other day I was really upset about something. I was actually crying. And, like, in his way, he came and he brought me some comfort. Because, like, between sleeping and eating, I would eat. So, he's like, here, have a cookie and some milk. I'm like, yes, thank you. Right. So just small acts of kindness and decency and care give me.
See, and that's where we differ because see, if I don't I guess we all suffer from depression in a sense, but see, if whenever I get in a situation where I'm getting depressed, guess what? I go to sleep. And then when I wake up, my world seems much brighter. But that was kind of it's the same thing with your son bringing you that milk and that cookie. That was something that soothed you and allowed you to escape whatever you were experiencing at that time.
Mhm, mhm.
And so what is your outlook? I mean, and how does this like affect you and your future work?
Mhm. So my outlook is very much one of being a optimistic cynic. I do see I keep my eyes open to all the ways, all the things that humans are capable of, which means that, I see all the atrocities and all the injustices, but I also really see the beauty and love. And that is actually the future of my work is I am writing a second essay collection that's about love. And that really does feel like a discipline in these days.
Right.
And I am also writing some fiction that is about trying to keep my own practice of creative imagination alive, because I think that is another thing that, oppressors try to steal from us is our creative imagination. So I'm writing some fiction where I'm just inventing some worlds.
Wow. That
And
sounds great. Well, Jen, once you get close, please contact us so we can invite you back to the show. Jen, I want to thank you so much for sharing your time, your story, your wisdom with us today. Your work reminds us that healing isn't just personal, it's communal, creative, and courageous. So thank you for coming here today. I really enjoyed this experience of talking to you today.
my pleasure. Yes, likewise. Thanks, Carl, for having this podcast and for having me on. I also really enjoyed it, and I hope folks will check out my paperback, which is coming out at the end of August.
Okay, now give us the name of your book. Give us where it's located at online. Give us where we can order the paperback version. All these links, all the information will be in all our promos and in the story notes when we publish, your episode. So just name your book and let us know where we can get it.
Fantastic. It's called Nervous Essays on Heritage and Healing. You can buy it wherever books are sold. You can ask your local booksellers to stock it, and you can get it online, any online retailer, but I recommend bookshop.
Okay. To our listeners, if you want to learn more about Jen's writing and work, check out their books, Nervous, Making the Tongue Dry, and the anthology Closer to Liberation. You can also find them online and follow their journey in narrative justice and cultural democracy. Until next time, this is the All About Us podcast. Keep listening, keep learning, keep healing together. Have a great day. See you next time.